Oh, hey, it's you. Welcome back to the Black Pill. Let's talk about whether everything happens for a reason. Existential psychologists are, like everyone else, quite a mixed lot. When it comes to the question of meaning, we're divided, let's say, on the issue. We might be more comfortable with the diversity of opinions under the general heading of existential, or we might not. Some of the conversations can get fairly heated at the beginning. Sartre suggests there's no inherent meaning in life. Things happen for no reason, with no rationale or grand plan. People, of course, find order in events and comfort in that order. The idea of a meaningless universe is just terrifying to humans. According to Sartre, if we have a job here on Earth, it is to accept meaninglessness and live with it bravely, to bravely shoulder the absolute meaninglessness of existence. In other words, recourse to meaning might be construed as cowardice. And in that sort of de Beauvoir, Sartre, Camus spectrum, people suffer because we are a meaning seeking organism in a meaningless universe. Viktor Frankl, generally accepted as an existential psychologist, although he was a psychiatrist and called his own practice logotherapy, well, he had a different opinion. Despair, he suggested, equals suffering without meaning. I'll try and link you a little interview, and yeah. D equals S minus M. What does it mean? He accepted generally there's no inherent meaning in events, but also that people have a need for it. And that need is not at all cowardice. In fact, it can be courageous to find meaning in the most desperate of places. He knew what he was about. Frankel survived the camps in World War II. He chose not to flee the country, even though he had permission to leave. His elderly Jewish parents needed his care. When the Nazis came for him, one of the first things they did was burn his logotherapy manuscript in front of him in order to debase and dehumanize him, return him to the state of animal they thought fitting for a Jew under the Third Reich. On the way to the camps, he faced Sartrean reality over and over again. He went with the soldiers because they said so. There was no inherent meaning in their authority. He was sent to one train rather than another train, so he lived. He was sent through this line rather than that line, so he lived. His line went to the camps, the other line went to the mass murder facility. Only the condition of his birth, his maleness, saved him from gassing. Over and over again, an arbitrary decision by a man in a uniform saved his life but sent him into further suffering. There's no meaning inherent in any of this, no grand order set forth by a benevolent God, just the whims of young men with authority loaded and chambered and carried in a spare hand. Frankel didn't give in to the Sartrean reality. He worked, brutal work, with little food, no medicine, nothing of the Maslow hierarchy fulfilled, except that talked here, self actualization. He observed that there were essentially two kinds of inmates. Some could think of the future, imagine their wives and children alive, or brothers and sisters. Imagine going home, having a career, or at least a job. The others imagined no future, lived only for the next moment, mired in the minute to minute banality of suffering. The latter group tended to, according to Maslow, succumb to despair. There's no meaning in their suffering, nothing to live for, no reason to wake up to more suffering tomorrow, no hope of an end other than death. These are the ones who gave up, climbed the hill the Nazis seemed to keep for this purpose, and jumped to a fatal end below. Frankel had a meaning. He had his book, The Story of Logotherapy. It was just ashes in a waste tip now, except that it also lived in his head and lived in his observations. He imagined himself one day visiting America to lecture college students on the meaning of meaning, the use of logos to help distress. He had to have been aware of Nietzsche, the one who has a why to live can cope with almost any how. Frankel lived to enact this destiny. Meaning can mean a lot of things. In Zen tradition, meaning is found in banality, not in spite of banality. The highest expression of enlightenment is to be ordinary, to do ordinary things, sweep the floor, build your cooking fire, trim the hedgerow. The difference between the enlightened and the mundane is one does these tasks awake, with joy in all the small miracles of existence, while the other one does them asleep. Meaning can be fulfillment, relationships that consume you, work that sets you afire, a life lived well. Frankel knew these things, although he wrote too often and too excitedly of finding an explicit meaning for someone, handing it to them and pronouncing them cured. Here's the banality. Here's the cliche. Everything happens for a reason. A well intentioned platitude that leads us away from truth. Sometimes the truth is that grief matters, that trauma matters, that violation matters. Everything happens for a reason is an undue invitation to cheer up, get over it, move on, let it lie. Look to the future. But there might be a bigger meaning in our grief. For example, grief informs us of our values, and grieving publicly, socially, helps us achieve a new relationship with the dead, internalize their most important qualities, remember them in our actions and feelings and not only in stories. Death didn't happen for a reason, a cosmic reason. It's just that we're beings on the middle scale, not gods, not angels, not worms or feces, not galactically huge, engulfing light speed distances, not microscopically tiny, neither completely ephemeral nor eternal. Middling beings that come into being, do the best we can, and then die one day, according to no special plan. We're in deadly danger of taking too firm a position on this. Our get over it culture that values only optimism, youth, and good looks represses too much of our guilt and grief in meaning telling, and conversely offers us too little time and space for meaning making. Grieve in a way other people are distressed by, and you might find yourself medicated for depression, unable to feel the anguish that informs you. Short of that, people will assail you with their platitudes around death and grief and loss, drive you to feel your feelings are inappropriate, that your faith is too weak when you feel sadness. After all, if your loved one is with God now, how can you grieve them? Your tears seem a contradiction of the comforting story. Life is no good without some trauma. On average, people need about 3 traumatic events in their lives in order to feel satisfied with their time on Earth by age 65. This is Aging Well, George Vaillant. It's the Harvard longitudinal study outcomes. It's a weird finding. It's a weird finding. Encoded in song, accidentally, by the great philosophers of the last century, the mighty, mighty boss tones. I'm not a coward, they sing. I've just never been tested. I'd like to think that if I was, I would pass. Look at the tested and think, there, but for the grace go I. I'm not a coward. I'm afraid I might find out. We need to be tested. We need to try ourselves against life, to discover in ourselves the courage, empathy, compassion, mettle, determination to carry on, to learn that grief is vital but not final. That truth and courage are in the event and in the rituals of burial and in the isolation of grief, and also on the other side of it when we've grieved enough to make sense of the grief. Perhaps everything does happen for a reason. I can't prove otherwise, after all. But perhaps it is best to leave that reason be and not force it. Because the meaning is in the journey, and there are no shortcuts. Black Bill out.